First off, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Jehl for all of her help in this process of creating this project and for being able to put all of my crazy thoughts into this project that we have come up with. Ahora es el tiempo para los posibles efectos diferenciados de las actitudes lingüísticas en los procesos de aprendizaje en el extranjero y en el segundo idioma. Now, while I should probably practice my Spanish because I leave for Ecuador in 5 days, I'm not going to do this whole presentation in Spanish because whether or not you know it, there's probably some attitudes that you hold towards Spanish speakers, and that was kind of the basis for what I decided to explore through this project. Personally, I was affected when I helped a second grade class that was highly Burmese and highly Hispanic, and I didn't realize what a need there was for English language teachers here in just Fort Wayne. And as I did more research, I realized that there was a bigger need for it in the Midwest and across the United States as a whole. And then I found out about this opportunity to go teach English in Ecuador and jumped on that. So then when I met with Dr. Jehl, we talked about specifically looking at the English language in Ecuador versus the English language in the United States. Professionally, I chose to do this project to help me as a future educator and to be able to educate my colleagues, especially in the world of English language learning, to understand that these attitudes that are not always present, we don't always know that they're there, that they can make a big difference in the learning of our students. So to get started, it's important to look at the definitions that were the basis of this project. First is attitude. Attitude has many different definitions that I found. One of the most simple was from the Dictionary of Sociolinguistics, and it's just that the views and opinions people have about language and language variation. It's simple, straight to the point, and attitudes are just the views and opinions that people have. However, over the year that I've been working on this, there's many more factors that fall into this process of language learning, including some of the extra-linguistic factors specifically towards the speaker, the geopolitical status of the country that the speaker is from, the socioeconomic status of the speaker, and the education of the speaker, all are important, as well as the geopolitical status of the language that the speaker speaks. Oppenheim describes attitudes as acquired and modified by reacting to the attitudes of others. And Garrett goes on to say that these reactions can be positive or negative, but each of them carry a specific social meaning. And that's kind of what depends on each situation. Johnson & Johnson takes it a step further and relates it specifically to teachers and reminds teachers that as important as it is to pick attractive materials to engage your class, examining the attitudes that are present in your classroom can be just as beneficial when creating a lesson. And something that I found, what I think is one of the most important things for attitude is to remember that they're not always conscious. And even once you bring them to the forefront, for example, after I do this presentation, you still might not be able to recognize those attitudes that you have towards this language. Second is the majority language, which is spoken by the majority of the people, or it might be the language in power. So for example, it's what the government uses, it might be what the street signage is in, it might be what the major news station is spoken in. The minority language would be that language spoken by the minority. The prestigious language is usually spoken by the elite or by the business class of the nation. Not everyone has access to this language necessarily. So for example, in the United States, a prestigious language would be English. It's what we use for the majority of working here. But in Ecuador, English would also be a prestigious language there. Only the elite have access to it. Usually not everyone can learn the language. A stigmatized language is more of a language that carries some extra connotations with it. So for example, Spanish speakers in the United States are stigmatized, and they are speaking technically a stigmatized language because when you hear Spanish speakers, you might think of maybe where they're from, what they look like, where they work. All of these different things come to mind just because of the language that they speak. In Ecuador, contrarily, the stigmatized language would be the indigenous languages there, which puts Spanish as a prestigious language. So in Ecuador, Spanish and English are both considered prestigious because of the indigenous languages that are present in Ecuador. It's also important to note that prestigious languages and stigmatized languages are not consistent. They haven't been consistent through history because it's the geopolitical status of the country and of the language are both so important when determining what type of language it is. Your native language, which we also refer to in language acquisition as your L1. Your native language is learned usually with minimal effort. It's what you're brought up with in your home. And a subgroup of native language that is important to know is our heritage language, is the heritage language or heritage language learners. This specific language is, the best way to put it is an example. So if you had an immigrant family from Ecuador who speaks Spanish come to the United States, then they would probably speak Spanish in the home. That's what the parents speak. Maybe the grandparents came. That's what they speak as well. Their children can speak Spanish. However, they've never been formally schooled in Spanish because they came at such a young age, or maybe they were born in the United States. The heritage language comes into effect because they've never been formally schooled. However, these students, these younger children, probably go to an English-speaking school. So they're being formally taught English in reading and writing and communication. Your target language is any language you want to learn. So currently my target language is Spanish. I've been practicing so I can communicate when I go to Ecuador. If you want to take a trip to Italy, you might start learning Italian. That would become your target language. It can be any language. For this specific project, the target language is always English. That's what all of the people that I looked at are wanting to learn. Your second language, which we refer to as the L2, it's just the second language that you would happen to learn. So for all of the people that I've been talking, all of the students are learning, their second language would be English. However, it's important to look at the context that second language is taught in. A second language context specifically is if you are in an immersive culture. So when you come to the United States and you want to learn English here, that would be, not only are you probably taking classes on how to speak English and how to write it formally and all those types of things, but you're also being informally taught. So maybe through conversations that you would have at work or that these students might have at school or on the street, on the bus, things like that would also informally teach you in a second language context, compared to a foreign language context, which is only school. So when you're learning English in Ecuador, that is learning as a foreign language because these students are only learning in the school setting compared to second language, which is very immersive. So, like I said, I was born in the United States. I was raised here in the United States, and so I looked at the United States as a comparison to Ecuador since I'll be there in just a few short days. It's important to look at the context of each place individually and decide how English is being learned and how English is being taught there. And then I looked at the student attitudes, teacher attitudes, and societal attitudes that are placed on this English language learning process. So to start, in the United States, the context is second language learning, like I said before. It's a very immersive situation for these English language learners. Usually their motivation is to just become a member of society, and because of this, they have a high preparedness to learn. They want to learn and they're highly motivated. They have a positive outlook towards learning this language because they need it. On a microsocial level, it's important to note that Seville Troiki points out that the language learner focuses on what he or she needs to know for their specific community that they're in. So if you were learning English in New York, you might learn about the subway versus learning English in Fort Wayne where we wouldn't need to know something like that. So student attitudes come from, a large one is from the attitude that they have towards their native language. Like I talked about previously, if they view their native language as one of those stigmatized languages, then they may have a more positive outlook towards the English language because they think that what they are used to or what their native language was isn't thought of as much here in the United States. Their perception of their teachers comes into play because they need whether or not they understand their teachers. If they do understand their teachers, then they probably have a better attitude, a more positive attitude towards the English language. But if they don't understand their teachers, it may cause them to withdraw from this experience of learning English and almost shut down, and they won't get as much of a learning experience as they could have, which kind of leads into the next point of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which if teachers have, if the students aren't expecting or aren't understanding their teachers as much, it might mean that the teachers have a low expectation of their students. And whatever your expectations are of your students, the self-fulfilling prophecy says that the students will rise to that occasion. So if you hold high expectations, the students will then have higher expectations for themselves. If you hold low expectations, they'll only meet those low expectations and not reach their full potential. Teacher attitudes, I specifically looked at pre-service teacher attitudes. There's not much data on this, but I'm a pre-service teacher, so I figured understanding what there is out there for research from my point of view would be important. And one of the pre-service teacher attitudes is the traditionalist view, which focuses on the correctness of grammar and how important it is to know these rules and understand them. Where when you're teaching English as a second language, it's more important for the student to feel comfortable communicating because of the context that they need it in. Therefore, the traditionalist view almost shows lack of appreciation for the complexity of language. And we know now, especially after I did so much research, that language is much more than just grammar rules. There's all of these different attitudes that come into play, the different contexts that come into play. And so usually pre-service teachers that have either been exposed to different cultures because of moving or possibly family members or friends they've met, if they've studied another language, other things like that may make them appreciate the language more and help their future students that are English language learners more beneficially. Conflicting ideas about inclusion are the idea that most teachers want their students to learn and they want them to benefit from the whole classroom experience. ELL inclusion specifically is when you take a child and you put them directly into the classroom. There may be little to no services, there may be little to no testing, and while teachers think that it's a good idea, or they want to say it's a good idea, when you ask them specifically certain situations with ELL inclusion in their classroom, they believe that not only does the English language learner fall behind because they can't focus enough energy and attention on them, the rest of the class also will possibly not receive as much instruction because some of the time and energy that should be focused on the whole class is now focused on that one individual student. As far as society attitudes towards Spanish speakers in the United States goes, it's fairly easy to look maybe on the news or in the newspaper and see what society thinks of different cultures and different languages specifically. But I think it's important to point out the positives that we have. Kim Patowski did a TED Talk and it was titled No Child Left Monolingual, which she focuses on the fact when we're teaching these English language learners English as a second language, we should not try to get rid of their dialect from their native language, and instead it should be like an English plus nation is how she describes it. Currently we're kind of an English only nation. We really press English on our foreign language or on our second language learners, and we don't always point to the fact that we could add to the repertoire of languages and just have multiple languages, English plus, to our society. So now, looking at a couple more elements of second language learning that I think are important are the terms of languaging and bilanguaging, which refers to how reading and thinking take place between two languages. Mignolo points out that he believes that learning languages should, instead of being a new set of rules and a new set of guidelines to follow, it should be used as more of a strategy to orientate yourself or to be able to manipulate a social interaction that you're encountering. McLaughlin encourages teachers to be innovative. Don't look at the fact that we have all this new cultural diversity in our classrooms as a problem. Take it as a challenge and just do the best you can to include that student and possibly show others how great this cultural diversity is through the language. And then Garcia also points out that power differentials and tensions don't necessarily need to be there if we were just more knowledgeable and more open to the fact that this could be an English plus nation instead of an English only nation in regards to language. So in Ecuador, the context of learning English would be a foreign language. Like I said, it's because you're only learning it in the classroom. It's a very formal setting. Usually you focus on grammar, reading, writing, possibly some listening, some communication. The motivation in Ecuador to learn English, over half of students surveyed were said that it was because they had to. In Ecuador, it's mandatory to take English from 8th grade through 12th grade, or what they call secondary school, which would be high school here in America. But 42% of those secondary students said that they wanted to take it for university, which leads to the idea that they are possibly thinking of going to an American university or possibly a university overseas where they would need to speak English or need to communicate. The macro-social context is more important in Ecuador versus the micro-social context, because when you're comparing the macro-social context, you're looking at the global and national status of the language and of the future careers possibly of these students that are learning English. It might be political, it might be a business, it might be something along those lines, and that's why they want to learn this language. Also in the macro-social context, it's important to look at what the role of the user will be. So in Ecuador, when they're learning English, is it because they're going to become an immigrant? Are they going to be an international student? Are they going to be a visiting dignitary? All these different reasons provide different outlets for the reason why English language learners in Ecuador want to learn English. So once again, student attitudes are towards their native language, kind of similar to how does the United States. If they think English is a glorified language and they think that it's better for whatever reason than their native language, they will pursue the English with a greater, more positive attitude compared to what they think of their native language. And the anxiety towards the target language, which would be English in this case, it might come from an over-comparison to other students in the classroom. It might come from over-comparison to the teacher, a desire to be like the teacher, or a desire to want the teacher to like them. An emphasis, if the teacher puts a lot of emphasis on grades or tests, this may all cause anxiety for the English language learner in Ecuador and leads to withdrawal of the language in a not as great educational experience for them. In Ecuador, teacher attitudes have been improving recently. Since 2012, they started the Go Teacher Partnership, which partners teachers in Ecuador who have been teaching for some time. They already have a passion for teaching, they love teaching, and usually they pick the better teachers. They send them to American colleges and universities to better their English, to learn how to teach English from an American perspective. And this was all put in place by Ecuador's president, President Correa, because he said that he came to the United States for college, and he states in Leggett's article that the United States has one of the best education systems in the world, and so he wants to model Ecuador's system after theirs now. So he's promoting this idea of good teachers and teaching English to kind of model what he saw when he was in the United States. Societal attitudes in Ecuador, there's kind of a divide. As much as they want English and they see English around, Spanish is still definitely the prominent language. It's the official language of Ecuador. And the elite bilingual refers to those who speak Spanish and learn how to speak English, versus the minoritized bilinguals who come into play. They're the ones who speak the indigenous language and then they learn Spanish. So while they're still bilingual, they view their bilingualism as lesser than those who can speak English. And there's very small possibilities for those who speak the indigenous language to learn English without the Spanish transition in between. The status of the English language is seen through Ecuador. Usually in Ovazader she did a study throughout Ecuador and looked at where English is present. And it's mostly present in shopping malls of the higher social strata, at the more expensive stores that have English brands there. And she relates this back to the fact that this higher social class that can afford these higher brands has probably had a better chance at a more quality education in which English was more prominent in their lives. And then other important elements for Ecuador include moving to the United States and loss of identity. Those kind of go hand in hand, basically because when they move to the United States, just knowing the language isn't necessarily enough for them. Sometimes they don't realize the social context, all of these different things, all of the different attitudes that are going to be placed on them because of the extra linguistic factors that they didn't even realize were there because they were learning it as a foreign language. And then government action Montero did lots of studies around the world of implementing bilingual legislation in different countries, and it showed more divide among the countries instead of promoting this bilingual culture. So he suggests that Ecuador does not do this, but the British Council they did research recently that showed there's legislation being passed in Ecuador to mandate English starting in grade 2 through grade 12. So the students would get much more exposure to English compared to right now. It's some schools have it grades 2 to 7, and then it's mandatory starting at grade 8. So just starting it nearly 6 years earlier would make a big difference in what students learn. So in conclusion, one of the most important things I found was through all of these different researchers, I realized that attitudes play a much bigger role than I realized. And the fact that we don't even know that they're always there creates kind of this invisible barrier that that sometimes may be the cause for much more than what we originally thought. Gonzalez, Moll, and Amonte came up with funds of knowledge, which is bringing light to how important cultural diversity is. And it kind of, the best way that I interpreted it is that everyone kind of has something to bring to the table. And the easiest way to incorporate funds of knowledge in possibly my classroom here in the United States someday would be if I had a Hispanic family that's they're heritage speakers, they speak Spanish at home, I ask the family to cook a traditional dish and bring it into my classroom and share something from their childhood from wherever they're from. Or something along those lines that just shows that all cultures are important. Kim Potowski in her TED Talk also talked about a school that had multiple different cultures within it, and each week they learned a new phrase from a different culture, and the whole class would use it and experience it just to show how important cultural diversity is instead of kind of masking that feature. One of my favorite things I learned was that success can't really be defined. There's no clear definition of success for second language or foreign language acquisition, because if you would say success is fluency, you're leaving out all of the extra linguistic factors and all of the attitudes that I've studied and all of the different social contexts, and each thing is case by case. So how can you define success with one clear-cut definition? And finally, from my experience here in the United States, and specifically in Fort Wayne, I've talked to multiple friends who maybe are from a foreign country or don't speak English as their first language, and they said that learning English was the hardest language to learn. Whether or not it was only the second language they learned, or maybe it was the third or fourth, I'm not entirely sure, but they said English was the hardest language to learn. And at first I just thought maybe it's because we have lots of words that look the same but are read differently, or maybe like our letters change. I figured it was more grammar rules. But through all of this, I realized that it's more of the social context and understanding all of these attitudes that come into play from both those that are teaching the language, those that are learning the language, and the society that the language is being learned in. So, yep. Mm-hmm.
I have a couple questions. The first one, so I see that you concentrated on your research or your project on Ecuador. Have you looked into to other countries, and how, for example, you said in Ecuador, English is the language that, this is the second language or the more target language, right?
Yeah.
So if it was a country that is more than one language spoken within the country, is the attitude would be the same, the societal attitude, the teacher attitude, the student attitude, whatever, is it also similar to what it is in a country that is one language that is spoken in it, and then there's a main foreign language that is being taught or implemented in the country? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm wording it correctly.
I think so. It like I said, it's case by case, but it really depends on the geopolitical status of both languages, and then where the languages are coming from. So if the status of one country is, and the language that they speak there is lesser than the other one, then it would kind of follow similar traits as how Ecuador is, if that makes sense. But if you were to possibly go I don't want to say something that isn't true, but go to another country where their language is also highly sought after, then it might not entirely be exactly the same as you would see in Ecuador, but it would follow similar traits as far as the prestigious language and the stigmatized language and the second language versus foreign language context. All of those terms could be placed into that context, if that makes sense.
My other question is, so you explained the difference between the target language and the second language. The target language is more in the classroom, and then the second language is when you're actually in the country, you're learning more about the language and the culture and all that. So what would differentiate the second language? Because you mentioned, when you say second language, does that mean specifically it has to be the second language other than the mother language of the person, or a second language as in a different language? Because I'm confused on the second language term based on the definition you gave versus the foreign language.
So your target language is any language that you want to learn. It could be your second language, your third language. It could be some phrases you want to learn from a certain language. Your target language can be anything. The two that are more important to compare would be the second language learning versus the foreign language learning. Your second language learning may not be exactly the second language that you learn necessarily, but the context of second language learning is that it's an immersive situation. So you've probably moved to that country where they speak that language. So if I was going to move to Germany right now, then that would be, even though I've learned Spanish already, me learning German in that situation would be a second language learning experience versus the foreign language, which is only in the classroom.
And last question, sorry, for me. So this study that you have here, this research that you have here, is it just specifically on Ecuador, based on Ecuador, or generally also other countries?
It's specifically on Ecuador. Through lots of the research that I did, I looked at different countries and kind of what happened in those countries, but I specifically based everything on Ecuador and made just to make it more specific and comparable to what I know in the United States. Yep.
I know that English is a hard language to learn as a person who's experienced it personally, having, 4 different languages and then having to come here and learn English. It's actually a really difficult language to learn. In your research, did you find any difference in attitudes between teachers who were teaching English in Ecuador and teachers who were teaching it here, especially considering the fact that those teachers who were teaching in the United States, English is a first language to them, and those who were teaching English in Ecuador, it might be a second or third language to them. Was there an attitudinal difference between the two teachers?
So the attitudes that the teachers portray would just come from the context that it's in. So like you said, it might be their first language if they're teaching here in the United States, and therefore they may not understand all the difficulties that go into learning the language because they were grown up, it was their native language. Compared to the teachers that are teaching in Ecuador who learned Spanish first and then learned English, whether they learned in a foreign language context or a second language context, would kind of determine their attitudes towards teaching the language to these new students.
Hi.
Hi.
I enjoyed your talk. It was very comprehensive and in looking at attitudes and different factors involved. So my question concerns attitudes within the United States, and I'm wondering whether what you learned about variation in attitudes across the United States. I would expect that there would be a lot of variation, say, in attitudes toward language learning, a lot of variation between, say, people who live in southern Arizona along the Mexican border and people who live maybe in North Dakota, and that there'd be a lot of variation in attitudes between people who live in Queens and New York, a tremendous ethnic diversity, and people who live in a place like Fort Wayne that has somewhat less ethnic diversity. So I would think that this came up in at least some of the research. Do you have any sense can you describe some of the variation that you might have noticed?
So because I had the assumption when I started this project that the United States is such a big country and we have such a diverse culture throughout it that, like all the places you stated, depending on where you are, there would be different attitudes in those different places. I did my best to focus on the Midwest only because it's where I'm from, and I felt as though I knew or I was able to relate the most to this area. Like you said, I mean, I was just in Arizona last week, and there was major cultural diversity down there. When I was on the train, there was people speaking Spanish right next to me, where if I was on a train here, I mean, not in Fort Wayne necessarily, but maybe around here, then I might not experience that. So depending on where you are, obviously the attitudes change. I think it's also important to note that where there's need for those types of things, the attitudes make a difference. So because I feel a passion towards teaching English as a foreign language, and I've assessed the fact that these attitudes are present, and I've done lots of research in realizing the comprehensiveness of teaching English as a second language or English as a foreign language, I might be drawn to one of those places, and my attitudes have obviously changed than they were previously 2 years ago as a pre-service teacher just starting. So I think that a lot of the attitudes just matter, like you said, where you depend or where you end up in the United States.
I have a comment, and super congratulations, because really you did a wonderful job. What I see more regarding the larger view of the U.S., I really think that one very good path would be to go on, not leave the classroom because that's what you like, but going on into toward public policy, public education policy. Mm-hmm. And then maybe instead of rushing to larger places, I think that there is a big future if you use the experiences of other places to guide you in what you want to propose as changes in public policy regarding English, teaching English as a second language here in the Midwest, in the sense that rushing to New York or to Arizona would be great in terms of learning, because you would have lots of things to learn, but I would wonder about putting yourself as a developing fish in a very big pond, mm-hmm. instead of going as a developing fish to a big pond to learn, and then come back as a very strong middle fish, and there you will rise. Mm-hmm. And where you can put all your energy, not necessarily in fighting to make a place for you in a bigger place, but focusing your energy in working here. So again, making a parallel with the prestigious and the stigmatized languages, it might be tempting to say, oh, I want to leave this stigmatized language of mine, this stigmatized Midwest of mine, and go shine in this prestigious place in New York or wherever. And well, actually, there might be more to gain if you go pick up what you have to learn there and then come back and use what you know, because there are less people here that know what you know. Mm-hmm. And in other places of the US, people don't know what you know about the Midwest, mm-hmm. which is your culture, your language, your turf. So that would be my...
Thank you.
Well done, Ariana.
Thank you.